The church was silent except for my mother's quiet sobs as we stood by my father's casket, mourning the man who had built our family. The weight of grief was already unbearable, but just as the priest was about to speak, the heavy wooden doors swung open. A woman I had never seen before walked in, very pregnant, very confident, and holding a stack of papers in her manicured hand. "I have every right to be here," she announced, her voice cutting through the heavy air. "This child is your father's, and I want what we are owed." A collective gasp spread through the church. My mother's face drained of color, and relatives whispered furiously among themselves. The grief in my mother's eyes turned to devastation as she clutched my arm, struggling to stay upright. But while everyone else was falling apart, I remained calm. Because what the mistress didn't know, what no one knew, was that I had already uncovered the truth weeks ago. And as she stood there demanding half of everything my father had left behind, I reached into my bag, pulled out a single document, and handed it to my mother. The moment she read it, her tears stopped, her back straightened, and for the first time since my father's death, she smiled. The funeral had been planned down to the smallest detail, every flower arrangement chosen carefully, every speech prepared in advance, every moment crafted to honor my father's life. My mother, despite her grief, had handled everything with quiet strength, determined to give the man she loved a dignified farewell. Family and friends filled the church, dressed in black, their faces solemn as they murmured condolences, sharing old stories about the man we had just laid to rest. The atmosphere was heavy with loss, the air thick with whispered prayers and muffled sobs, a collective mourning that had gathered to send him off in peace. But the moment the church doors swung open, the air changed instantly, the weight of mourning replaced by something heavier: shock, confusion, and betrayal. A woman I had never seen before stood in the doorway, her long dark hair cascading over her shoulders, her face set in an expression that was far too composed for a funeral. But what stood out the most wasn't the smug tilt of her lips, nor the designer dress she had chosen for the occasion. It was the very pregnant stomach she cradled with both hands, as if to draw attention to it, as if to make a statement before she even spoke. Every head in the church turned as she stepped forward, her heels clicking against the marble floor, her movements slow and deliberate, her presence a sharp contrast to the grieving room. She didn't look like a woman mourning a loss. She looked like a woman making an entrance. And then, in a voice that carried across the silent room with eerie confidence, she made her announcement. "I have every right to be here," she said, her gaze locked onto my mother like a predator watching its prey. "This child is your husband's. And I am here to claim what is rightfully ours." The collective gasp that followed was deafening, a wave of murmurs spreading like wildfire through the stunned congregation. My mother's grip tightened around the edge of the pew, her breath hitching, her entire body trembling as if the weight of the words had physically struck her. My aunts exchanged horrified glances, my uncles muttered under their breath, and my father's closest friends looked as if they had been slapped across the face. Even the priest, who had been standing at the altar preparing to begin the service, hesitated, his fingers tightening around his Bible as if unsure whether to proceed. I felt my own pulse spike, my fingers curling into fists at my sides, the fury rising inside me so fast it nearly made me dizzy. This was not just some grieving woman paying her respects, not some long-lost friend who had come to say goodbye. This was my father's mistress, his pregnant mistress, who had chosen this exact moment, this sacred day, to drop a bombshell that she knew would rip my mother apart. And from the smug way she held herself, from the way her lips curled ever so slightly as she watched the chaos unfold, I knew that this had been her plan all along. "How dare you?" My Aunt Rose, the most outspoken of my mother's sisters, was the first to recover from the shock, her voice a sharp, disbelieving hiss. "Do you have no shame?" Barging in herewith, she gestured furiously at the woman's stomach, her voice cutting off in disgust. The mistress didn't flinch, didn't cower, didn't even blink at the hostility being thrown her way. If anything, she seemed to revel in it, as if she had expected it, as if she had prepared for every possible reaction. She lifted her chin slightly, her fingers brushing over her belly in an almost theatrical display of maternal instinct. "I came here for what belongs to my child," she said smoothly, her gaze sweeping over the crowd before settling once again on my mother. "I know about the inheritance. And as the mother of his unborn child, I have every right to claim half. The word hung in the air like a guillotine, an unspoken horror that seemed to suck the breath from the room. My mother let out a quiet, strangled gasp, her nails digging into the fabric of her dress, her entire body wavering as if she might collapse under the sheer weight of betrayal. I reached for her instinctively, steadying her, my jaw clenched so tightly I could feel the ache spreading up into my temples. This woman had not come here to mourn. She had not come here for closure. She had come here to take. "You have no right to anything," I said, my voice even, controlled, despite the fury burning beneath my skin. The mistress turned to me then, her expression shifting just slightly, a flicker of something unreadable passing through her gaze. But I didn't give her time to speak. "My father is gone. My mother is his wife. And this is her day, her grief, her loss. You had no place in his life then, and you sure as hell have no place in his death now." She smiled then, a slow, knowing smirk that sent a fresh wave of anger pulsing through my veins. "That's where you're wrong," she said simply, her fingers tapping against the folder she held in her other hand, a folder I hadn't noticed until now. She lifted it slightly, as if presenting it to the room, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Because your father left behind more than just a grieving wife. And I have the proof right here." A cold dread settled over me as she took another step forward, handing the folder to the lawyer who had handled my father's estate, a man who now looked as though he wished he were anywhere but here. The moment his eyes landed on the papers, his expression darkened, his throat bobbing as he swallowed thickly, his fingers tightening around the pages as if he could somehow will them into saying something else. The room held its breath. And then, my mother whispered, her voice barely audible but laced with devastation. "Please tell me this isn't real." But the look on the lawyer's face, the tension in his posture, the way his hands trembled ever so slightly as he turned the pages, it was real. It was real. And for the first time since my father's death, I realized something terrifying. This was far from over. Gasps rippled through the room, a wave of whispers following in their wake as the woman stood there, unmoved by the chaos she had just caused, her confidence unshaken even as the weight of her words settled like a bomb in the middle of the funeral. My mother's face was pale, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the pew, her knuckles turning white from the force of her grip. My relatives exchanged nervous glances, some of them inching closer as if expecting an all-out war to break out right there in the middle of the church, their hushed voices mixing with the stunned silence that had swallowed the room whole. The woman took a step forward, slow and deliberate, the kind of movement that made it clear she was comfortable here, that she was not afraid, that she had planned this moment down to every last detail. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a crisp, neatly organized folder, its contents thick, its purpose unmistakable. Holding it up for all to see, she turned her attention back to my mother, her expression unreadable, her voice eerily calm, her words spoken with the kind of confidence that only someone who believes they are untouchable could ever possess. "Your husband made promises to me," she said, tilting her head slightly, as if she were the victim in all of this. "He told me he would take care of me. He told me this baby would have everything he deserved. And I'm here to make sure that happens." I could see the way my mother's chest rose and fell in shallow, panicked breaths, the way her shoulders trembled beneath the weight of humiliation, the way her entire body seemed to shrink as she absorbed the reality of what was happening. She had just lost her husband, had just buried the man she had built a life with, had just spent days drowning in grief, only to now be forced to publicly face the fact that he had betrayed her in the worst possible way. But while my mother was struggling to stay upright, while she was still trying to process the cruel spectacle unfolding before her, I was already 10 steps ahead. The woman smirked slightly, her fingers drumming against the folder, her gaze flickering around the church as if she was enjoying the attention, as if she wanted everyone to see this, as if she had orchestrated this moment to ensure maximum humiliation. She was thriving in the destruction she had caused, basking in the stunned reactions, feeding off the devastation in my mother's eyes like it was entertainment. I wanted to lunge across the room, wanted to rip that folder out of her hands, wanted to wipe that smug expression right off her face, but I knew better. This wasn't a fight that could be won with rage. This was a battle that had to be fought strategically. "You should be ashamed of yourself," Aunt Rose snapped, her voice cutting through the tense silence, her fury crackling like electricity in the air. She was practically shaking, her hands clenched into fists at her sides, her eyes burning with a kind of rage that could have set the entire church on fire. "Coming in here, to his funeral, while his wife is grieving. Do you have any dignity, or did you lose that along with your morals?" The mistress didn't even blink at the insult, didn't flinch, didn't show a single ounce of shame. Instead, she let out a quiet, almost amused breath, as if Aunt Rose's anger was nothing more than an inconvenience, as if we were the ones making this difficult for her. "I understand this is hard for you," she said, her voice syrupy sweet, her head tilting in false sympathy. "But my child deserves to be acknowledged. My child deserves to have a future. And I will not be dismissed just because it makes you uncomfortable." Uncomfortable. My voice was steady, controlled, but there was a sharpness to it that made her eyes finally snap toward me. "You think this is about discomfort?" I took a step forward, my heart pounding, but my expression unreadable, my anger masked beneath an icy calm that made her confidence flicker for the first time. "My father is dead. My mother is mourning. And you, a woman who had no place in his life, just waltzed into this funeral and announced his betrayal like it was your moment to shine. You're not here for justice. You're here for money. So let's stop pretending this is about anything else." A hush fell over the room, the mistress's nostrils flaring slightly, her grip on the folder tightening, her body going stiff as she realized I was not easily rattled. She had come in expecting tears, expecting breakdowns, expecting my mother to collapse under the weight of humiliation and grief. But she hadn't expected me. "You seem confident," she said, her voice laced with amusement, but I could see the tension creeping into her posture, the slight edge to her words, the way she was beginning to realize she was up against something she hadn't accounted for. "Maybe you should look inside this folder before you embarrass yourself any further." She extended the folder toward me, as if daring me to take it, as if she believed whatever was inside would be the final nail in the coffin, the proof that would force my mother into submission. But I didn't move. I didn't so much as glance at the folder. Instead, I let out a small, cold laugh, shaking my head slowly as I looked at her with pity. "Oh, sweetheart," I said, my voice softer now, almost gentle, almost mocking. "You think I haven't already seen it?" The shift in her face was instant. A crack. A flicker of doubt. A moment of realization. She had walked into this funeral believing she was the one with the upper hand, believing she held the only secrets, believing she was the only one who had been prepared for this battle. But she was wrong, because what she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that I had spent weeks preparing for this very moment. And she had just walked straight into my trap. The mistress smirked, as if she believed she had already won, as if she thought we were helpless, as if she expected my mother to fold under the weight of this shocking betrayal and accept her demands without question. She had walked into this funeral with an air of absolute confidence, convinced that she had the upper hand, convinced that we would be too broken, too overwhelmed, too lost in grief to fight back. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that I had spent the past few weeks digging, investigating, preparing for this exact moment. I had suspected something long before my father had passed, had noticed the unexplained absences, the quiet phone calls, the shifts in his behavior that didn't quite make sense. At first, I had dismissed it, told myself I was imagining things, that my father would never betray my mother like that. But something inside me had whispered otherwise, had warned me that there was more going on beneath the surface. And so, when he died, when the grief settled in but the questions remained, I had done what I always did. I searched for answers. And what I had found changed everything. I stepped forward, my voice steady as I looked her in the eye, watching as her smirk flickered ever so slightly as the first hint of doubt crept into her carefully composed expression. "You think you're entitled to something?" I asked, tilting my head just enough to make her uncomfortable, just enough to let her know that I wasn't intimidated, just enough to let her feel the shift in power. Her fingers tightened around the folder she was holding, her confidence momentarily shaken by the calm in my voice. "Well, let's see what my father had to say about that." The room was silent, every pair of eyes locked on us, the weight of anticipation pressing against my chest like a storm about to break. I reached into my bag, my movements slow, deliberate, giving her just enough time to worry, just enough time to wonder what I was about to do, just enough time for her certainty to start unraveling at the edges. And then, with one smooth motion, I pulled out the document, the real, final copy of my father's will. Not the version she had expected. Not the one she thought would guarantee her a fortune. Not the one that would grant her child a future funded by my father's wealth. This was the only will that mattered. The true will. The one that changed everything. I handed it to my mother, my fingers brushing against hers for just a second, a silent reassurance passing between us, a silent promise that she was not alone. She took it carefully, unfolding the pages with hands that were no longer shaking, with hands that, for the first time since my father's death, felt steady. Her teary eyes scanned the document, her breath hitching for a brief moment, her lips parting slightly as the reality of what she was reading sank in. And then, something inside her changed. The sadness on her face didn't disappear, but something stronger, something sharper, something unbreakable replaced it. She straightened her back, squared her shoulders, lifted her chin ever so slightly. No longer a widow lost in grief, no longer a woman drowning in betrayal, but a fighter who had just been handed the weapon she needed to win. The mistress, who had been so sure of herself just moments ago, who had held that smug smirk like a shield against any possible resistance, took a hesitant step forward, her confidence slipping further as she tried to peer over my mother's shoulder. "What does it say?" she demanded, her voice still trying to sound firm, still trying to sound in control, but there was an edge to it now, a nervousness that hadn't been there before. My mother looked up, her teary eyes now filled with something fierce, something unyielding, something that told me she had finally remembered who she was. And when she spoke, her voice didn't waver. "You're not getting a cent." The mistress froze. The room held its breath. And just like that, the woman who had stormed into my father's funeral expecting to walk away victorious had just realized that she had already lost. The mistress scoffed, snatching the document from my mother's hands with a force that made the pages crumple slightly at the edges, her eyes scanning the page rapidly, her confidence still intact, her arrogance still clinging to her like an ill-fitting coat. She still believed she had the upper hand, still believed that we were trying to deceive her, still believed that whatever was written in that will could be overturned, challenged, or manipulated to work in her favor. But then, as I watched closely, I saw it, the exact moment the reality of the situation sank in, the precise second she realized that something was very, very wrong. Her lips pressed into a thin line, the muscles in her jaw tightening as her fingers gripped the document so tightly that her knuckles turned white, her once cocky smirk fading with every word she read. Her eyes flickered over the legal text again and again, as if she expected the words to change, as if she thought she had misread something, as if she could not believe what she was looking at. And then, after a long, suffocating pause, she finally spoke, her voice no longer dripping with arrogance, but with something else, panic. "What is this?" she demanded, lifting her gaze to me, her expression darkening, the edges of her confidence starting to fray. I crossed my arms slowly, my expression unreadable, refusing to give her any sense of reassurance, refusing to let her see that this was exactly the reaction I had been waiting for. I tilted my head slightly, watching her closely, watching the way her fingers twitched as she clutched the document, watching the way her breathing had started to quicken, watching the way she was finally realizing that she was standing on unstable ground. "That's my father's real will," I said smoothly, my voice even, controlled, not an ounce of hesitation to be found. "The one he updated before he died. The one that doesn't include you at all." A slow, creeping silence fell over the church, a silence so thick it felt like it was pressing against the walls, making it impossible to breathe. My mother inhaled sharply, gripping the edge of the pew as if she was physically bracing herself for what was about to happen next. My aunts exchanged nervous glances, my uncles stiffened in their seats, the priest himself shifting uncomfortably near the altar, clearly wanting to be anywhere but here. But my eyes never left the mistress, never wavered from the woman who had stormed into this funeral believing she had the upper hand, believing she would walk away with half of everything my father had ever owned. And now, she was standing there empty-handed. "That's impossible," she muttered, shaking her head, her voice low, sharp, filled with a desperation she hadn't quite managed to suppress. He wouldn't do this. He promised me." She cut herself off abruptly, her fingers curling around the paper like she wanted to crush it in her grasp, her breathing uneven, her carefully built composure cracking right in front of me. "Did he?" I asked, my tone light, almost amused, tilting my head slightly as I studied her. "Or did he just tell you what you wanted to hear?" Her jaw clenched, her shoulders going rigid, her expression darkening into something venomous, something dangerously close to rage. I could see the wheels turning in her head, could see her trying to piece together an argument, a defense, anything to regain control of the situation. But she had nothing, because she had been lied to just like my mother had. And I was about to prove it. I reached into my bag again, this time pulling out a second folder, This one slightly thicker, slightly heavier, filled with papers that she had never seen before. I watched as her eyes darted toward it, suspicion flickering across her face, her grip tightening on the will like she thought it was the only thing that mattered. She was wrong. You didn't think my father only had one set of secrets, did you? I asked, my voice softer now, lower, letting the weight of my words sink in. I saw the way she stiffened at that, the way her fingers twitched, the way her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to interrupt me, wanted to demand an explanation, wanted to deny whatever I was about to say. But I didn't give her the chance. I flipped open the folder, my movements slow, methodical, deliberate, giving her just enough time to feel the dread settling in her chest. The papers inside weren't just copies of the will. They were bank records, financial statements, and hidden transactions from accounts my father had never told her about. And just like that, her entire world shifted. "What is this?" she repeated, her voice higher now, more frantic, her carefully composed persona starting to slip. "These," I said, holding up one of the bank statements, "are the accounts my father used to fund his secrets. And based on these transactions, based on these payments, based on the other women he was supporting, I'd say you should be very careful about claiming that baby is his." The color drained from her face instantly. My mother let out a sharp breath, her hand flying to her mouth, my aunts gasping audibly from the pews, the priest murmuring something under his breath, as if praying for this entire situation to disappear. The mistress, who had walked into this funeral so sure of herself, so certain that she had all the power, all the leverage, all the control, now stood frozen, her hands trembling slightly, her eyes darting across the papers as if somehow they would change, as if she could force them to mean something else. "No," she whispered, taking a slow step back, her expression unreadable, but her body language screaming fear. That's not possible." "It is," I said simply, flipping to another page, watching as her panic grew, watching as her certainty crumbled. "And if I were you, I'd think twice before demanding anything else. Because if you're not careful, you might just end up walking away with nothing." She opened her mouth as if to argue, as if to fight, as if to reclaim the power she had lost. But nothing came out. Because for the first time since she had walked into this funeral, she realized she had already lost. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating, pressing against the walls of the church like an unseen force, wrapping around every person in the room and squeezing the air from their lungs. Even the priest, who had remained still and composed throughout this entire ordeal, shifted uncomfortably near the altar, his hands gripping the Bible a little tighter, his expression unreadable as he glanced between my mother and the woman who had just lost everything. My mother's breathing had steadied, her tears drying as the crushing weight of betrayal slowly transformed into something else, vindication. Her posture straightened, her shoulders squared, the tremor in her hands finally stilling as she absorbed the truth that had just unfolded before her. She had spent the past few weeks drowning in grief, questioning everything she had ever known about her marriage, feeling like the rug had been pulled out from beneath her in the cruelest way imaginable. But now, sitting there with my father's real will in her lap, with the truth staring back at her in black and white, with the stunned silence of the entire congregation confirming that she had won, something in her had shifted. The mistress, however, wasn't handling it nearly as well. She flipped through the pages furiously, her fingers moving so fast they nearly tore the edges of the document, her breathing uneven, her expression twisting into something almost feral. Her eyes scanned the legal jargon as if she could somehow will the words to say something different, as if she could force the will to bend to her expectations, as if sheer disbelief could rewrite reality itself. Her grip tightened, her knuckles whitening as she turned wild, desperate eyes toward me, as if I was somehow responsible for this, as if I was the one who had betrayed her, as if I was the person who had spent years lying to her instead of the man she had been so desperate to claim. "This has to be a mistake," she hissed, her voice low, urgent, a stark contrast to the arrogant tone she had walked in with. She wasn't smirking anymore, wasn't holding herself with that same untouchable confidence, wasn't looking at my mother like she was nothing more than an obstacle in her path. "He wouldn't do this to me. He wouldn't do this to his child." But she didn't sound as sure as she had before. The weight of doubt was creeping into her voice, coiling around her words, settling in her expression like an unwelcome guest, the slow realization dawning that she may not have known my father as well as she thought she did. The people sitting in the pews had gone eerily still, their eyes darting between my mother and the woman who was now losing control, their whispered conversations from earlier completely silenced by the spectacle unfolding before them. My mother exhaled sharply, her fingers smoothing over the document in her lap, her voice steady for the first time since the woman had entered the church, her gaze lifting slowly to meet the mistress's furious stare. She didn't look broken anymore, didn't look like a woman who had just had her entire world shattered, didn't look like someone who was moments away from collapsing under the weight of betrayal. She looked calm. She looked certain. She looked like a woman who had just realized that she had nothing left to fear. Apparently he would, she said simply, her voice carrying through the room, steady, unwavering, unshaken. And for the first time in weeks, she smiled. It wasn't a cruel smile, wasn't a smug smile, wasn't a gloating, vindictive display of victory. It was a relieved smile, a freeing smile, the kind of smile that only comes when a person who has been drowning finally reaches the surface and takes their first breath of fresh air. It was the kind of smile that said, "I am done suffering for a man who never deserved my love in the first place." The mistress's nostrils flared, her face flushing with anger, her hands shaking as she clutched the will, her entire body rigid with frustration, her lips parting as if she wanted to scream. The smugness she had arrived with had vanished completely, the carefully constructed confidence she had worn like armor now crumbling under the weight of reality. I could see the war happening behind her eyes, could see her trying to come up with a way out of this, trying to think of an argument that would still work in her favor, trying to find something, anything, that could undo what had just been revealed. "No," she muttered under her breath, shaking her head as if trying to physically reject what was happening, as if sheer willpower could change the situation. "No, this isn't over. He promised me." He promised. Her voice cracked slightly, the first real fracture in her composure, the first undeniable sign that she was spiraling, that she was losing control in a way she had not anticipated. I stepped closer, tilting my head slightly, watching as her eyes flickered to me, filled with fury, filled with resentment, filled with a desperation that she didn't quite know how to contain. "Did he promise?" I asked, my voice slow, deliberate, letting each word sink in. "Or did you just assume he would clean up his mess before he died?" Her jaw clenched, her nails digging into the document, her entire body tense like a rubber band stretched too tight, ready to snap. She had walked in here expecting an easy victory, expecting my mother to fall apart, expecting to claim half of my father's estate without resistance. But instead, she had been met with the truth, the real truth, the undeniable truth, the truth she had never even considered a possibility. And she was unraveling right in front of me. "This is ridiculous," she snapped, her voice rising now, louder than before, her frustration bleeding through every syllable, no longer able to hide behind that cold, calculated composure. "You think I'm just going to walk away? You think I'm just going to let you steal what belongs to me? What belongs to his child's?" A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it, my patience wearing thin, my sympathy non-existent, my ability to care about her suffering absolutely gone. "Belongs to you?" I echoed, arching an eyebrow, shaking my head as I took another slow step forward. "You're standing here demanding a fortune from a man who clearly didn't want you to have it. You're talking about promises from a man who lied to both of us, who lied to my mother for decades. So maybe," I paused, lowering my voice just slightly, just enough to make her listen, "maybe, just maybe, the person you should really be mad at is the man who never planned to take care of you in the first place." Her entire body stiffened, her lips parting, her chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow breaths, her panic finally surfacing in full force. She had spent so much time believing she had been special. But now, she was starting to realize, she had just been another one of his mistakes. The mistress's entire demeanor shifted in an instant, her panic twisting into something darker, something sharper, something desperate, the realization of her defeat now morphing into something more dangerous. Her breathing was still uneven, her grip on the will still tense, but now her shoulders squared, her expression hardening, her stance shifting from stunned disbelief to something much more aggressive. She took a step forward, slow and deliberate, her presence looming over my mother like a shadow, her desperation bleeding through every movement, every flicker of emotion across her face. "I have rights," she spat, her voice shaking but firm, latching onto any ounce of control she could salvage, refusing to accept the truth that had just been laid out before her. "I don't care what that will says. This baby is still his, and I will fight for what is mine. If you think you can just push me aside, you're wrong." Her voice was growing louder now, the anger finally breaking through, her hands trembling as she clutched the crumpled pages of the will, as if she could somehow crush reality between her fingers. The entire room had fallen into a stunned, waiting silence. Every pair of eyes locked onto the confrontation unfolding, every breath held in anticipation of what would happen next. My mother stayed silent, her grip tightening on the document, her body still, her expression unreadable, her eyes locked onto the woman in front of her with something I couldn't quite place. She didn't react to the threat, didn't flinch at the venom in the mistress's voice, didn't let even the smallest flicker of fear cross her features. But I was done playing games. I had spent the past few weeks preparing for this, had spent endless nights digging through my father's carefully hidden secrets, had spent far too much time putting together every single piece of this puzzle, and now, as the woman before me seethed with fury, I knew it was time to reveal everything. I reached into my bag once more, my fingers brushing over the smooth edges of yet another folder, this one heavier, this one containing something even more damning than the will. Something that would shift the entire situation into something she wasn't prepared for. I pulled it out slowly, deliberately, making sure she saw it, making sure she had just enough time to wonder what else I had uncovered, making sure she had just enough time to panic. I watched as her eyes darted to it with barely concealed apprehension, her posture stiffening, her bravado faltering for just a moment, just long enough for me to see the doubt creep in. "You might want to rethink that threat," I said coolly, flipping the first page over, my voice sharp, controlled, unwavering. "Because you're about to have much bigger problems than an inheritance." Her breath hitched ever so slightly, a flicker of hesitation passing through her gaze, her confidence cracking at the edges, her bravado slipping just enough for me to see the fear creeping in. She had walked into this funeral thinking she had everything, the leverage, the power, the right to demand what she believed was owed to her. But now she was realizing that she didn't know everything. Now she was realizing that I had been prepared for this moment in a way she never could have expected. "What is that?" she asked, her voice sharper now, her attempt at control barely holding together, her hands clenching at her sides as she tried to maintain the dominance she had arrived with. I smirked, just slightly, just enough for her to notice, just enough for her to realize that she had no idea what was coming next. "Why don't you take a look and find out?" I said smoothly, sliding the folder onto the table between us, watching as she hesitated, watching as she debated whether or not to reach for it. She didn't want to look, because deep down, she knew whatever was inside that folder wasn't in her favor. But she had no choice. Slowly, cautiously, she reached for the folder, flipping open the top page, her eyes scanning the first few lines, her pupils dilating ever so slightly as she took in what was written there. I watched her expression shift in real time, watched as the blood drained from her face, watched as the anger in her eyes flickered into something far more raw, fear. "No," she whispered, shaking her head slightly, as if she could reject the truth staring back at her, as if she could force the words on the page to change. "This is fake. This has to be fake." But it wasn't fake. It was proof. It was the undeniable truth that my father had left behind far more than just a mistress and a scandal. He had left behind a trail of financial secrets that completely destroyed her claim to anything. "You see," I said, taking a slow step forward, my voice softer now, more deliberate, letting each word sink into her skull like a dagger. "My father wasn't exactly the man you thought he was. He wasn't just keeping secrets from my mother. He was keeping secrets from you, too." Her breath came in short, shallow bursts, her fingers gripping the edge of the folder so tightly that I thought she might tear through the paper, her mind racing, her world crumbling. "What the hell is this?" she demanded, her voice rising now, her panic barely contained, her need for control slipping away with every second that passed. "Bank records," I said simply, shrugging slightly, as if it wasn't about to completely shatter her last shred of hope. "Hidden accounts. Transactions made under fake business names. Money sent to women who aren't you. Payments for things that have nothing to do with this baby you claim is his. My father wasn't just having an affair with you. You were just one of his mistakes." Her face contorted in rage, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her entire body trembling now, not with power, not with confidence, but with pure, unfiltered humiliation. She had spent years believing she had been special. But now? She was realizing the truth. She was just one of many. The mistress blinked rapidly, her brows furrowing, her mouth opening and closing like she was struggling to form words, like she was grasping for a response but couldn't quite catch one. Her confidence, the arrogance that had carried her through the church doors, the smug certainty that she was the wronged party in this mess, was beginning to fracture right in front of me. I could see the flickers of doubt creeping in, the hesitation in the way she held herself, the sudden uncertainty in her eyes as she tried to calculate what I had just implied. But before she could demand an answer, before she could launch into another self-righteous monologue about how she deserved something from my father's estate, before she could gather enough anger to try and claw her way back into control, I turned the folder toward her, letting her see the contents for herself. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. The moment her eyes landed on the papers, her fingers twitched, her lips parted in a silent gasp, and just like that, the last remnants of her confidence collapsed. The color drained from her face instantly. "No," she whispered, taking a shaky step back, her voice trembling now, the sharp edge gone, replaced with something much more fragile. That's not possible." But it was possible. And I had the proof. My father had been careful, but not careful enough. He had kept secrets, hidden things well, moved money through accounts that weren't directly connected to him, but even the most careful man eventually makes mistakes. And my father? He had made many. The folder in my hands contained more than just financial records. It contained truths, the kind of truths that shattered illusions, the kind of truths that turned confidence into devastation, the kind of truths that tore apart the fantasy she had built for herself. "You thought you were the only one, didn't you?" I asked softly, watching as her hands trembled at her sides, as her breathing turned shallow, as the weight of my words pressed down on her like an avalanche. "You thought you were different, special, that he would leave my mother for you, that this baby would tie him to you forever. But you never stopped to ask yourself if he was lying to you too, did you?" She shook her head rapidly, as if trying to physically reject what she was hearing, as if she could undo reality by simply refusing to acknowledge it. Her hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms, so hard that I half expected to see blood. "You're lying," she spat, her voice shaky, but still laced with desperation. "He told me I was the only one. He told me he wanted a life with me. He told me he loved me." I let out a slow, measured breath, tilting my head slightly as I studied her, as I let the weight of her pathetic delusion settle in the space between us. "Did he?" I asked, flipping to the next page in the folder, holding it up just enough for her to see. "Or did he tell you exactly what you wanted to hear?" Her eyes darted toward the paper involuntarily, unable to stop herself from looking, unable to resist the pull of truth, even though I could see how badly she wanted to. Her breath hitched violently, her shoulders jerking slightly, her entire body stiffening as her gaze landed on something she never expected to see. The document in front of her wasn't just a bank statement. It was an email from my father, to another woman, a woman who wasn't her. "No," she whispered again, her voice so quiet it was barely audible, her entire body locked in place, her pupils dilating as she read the words, as she took in the undeniable proof that she had never been the only one. My father had made her believe she was, had made her feel secure in the affair, had made her think she had won something by stealing him from my mother. But the truth was so much worse than she had ever imagined. "He was engaged to her too," I said simply, my voice steady, my expression unreadable as I let her absorb the reality of the situation, as I let her world come crashing down in real time. "He promised her everything he promised you. The money, the future, the child. But guess what?" I flipped to another page, my gaze never leaving hers. There were 3 others. And that's just the ones we found. A sound escaped her lips, something raw, something between a breath and a sob, something broken. She took another step back, her balance unsteady, her fingers twitching as if she wanted to tear the papers from my hands, as if she wanted to rip reality apart and rebuild it into something that made sense to her. "He loved me," she whispered again, but this time the words sounded hollow, empty, meaningless, as if she was only saying them to convince herself, as if she needed to believe them, as if the only thing keeping her from falling apart completely was the delusion that she had mattered to him. "No," I said quietly, shaking my head slowly, finally letting my voice soften, finally letting the reality of it settle into my own chest. "He didn't." The weight of it pressed against her like an invisible force, her body trembling under the sheer gravity of knowing, of finally understanding that my father had never planned to stay with her, that he had never been honest, that she had never been different from the rest. Her baby might not have even been his, but that didn't even matter anymore. Because even if it was his, even if she could prove it with a DNA test, even if she tried to fight for something from his estate, the truth was clear. She had already lost. And she was starting to realize that she had never really won to begin with. The church, once filled with murmurs of shock, had fallen completely silent again as the weight of my revelation settled over the room, pressing down on every single person in attendance like an invisible force. The mistress, who had walked in here so sure of herself, so certain that she had power, so confident that she could demand what she thought was hers, now stood frozen, her hands trembling at her sides, her once smug expression shattered into pieces at her feet. The transformation was almost painful to watch, the slow unraveling of her reality, the way she swayed ever so slightly, as if she was struggling to keep her balance in a storm she hadn't expected. I could see it now, the realization dawning, the understanding sinking in, the horror of what if flickering across her features. The way her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something, as if she needed to argue, as if she was still trying to grasp onto whatever scraps of control she had left. But there was nothing left for her to hold on to, nothing but the gaping hole where her certainty used to be. She had been so sure of my father, so sure of her place in his life, so sure that this baby had given her leverage. But now? Now, she was realizing that she had made a mistake, a very big mistake. I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice just enough that only she could hear, my words slicing through the fragile silence between us like a blade. "You didn't think you were the only one, did you?" I asked, my tone calm, almost gentle, almost mocking, watching as her eyes widened with something dangerously close to fear. "Did my father ever actually tell you this baby was his? Or did you just assume? Because based on his financial records, based on the other women he was supporting, based on the paper trail he didn't think anyone would ever find, I'd say you should be very careful about what you claim." Her breath hitched, barely noticeable, barely audible, but I saw it. I saw the way her body went rigid, the way her fingers twitched at her sides, the way she sucked in a sharp, uneven breath as she processed what I'd just said. She had walked in here believing she was secure, believing she had the ultimate proof, believing that this baby was the one thing that could guarantee her a piece of my father's fortune. But now, for the first time, doubt was creeping in. The priest shifted uncomfortably in the background, his hands tightening around his Bible, his expression frozen somewhere between stunned and deeply uncomfortable, as if he wanted to intervene, but had no idea how. This was no longer just a funeral. This was something else entirely. This was a reckoning. But I wasn't done. I took a slow step back, straightening my posture, reaching into my bag once more, my fingers brushing over the smooth slip of paper I had been holding onto for exactly this moment. I could feel the weight of my mother's stare, could hear the hushed whispers of my aunts and uncles, could sense the way the entire room was holding its breath, waiting, watching, knowing that whatever happened next would decide everything. "So, if you're so sure," I continued, pulling out the smaller slip of paper, the one that would determine everything, the one that would either confirm or destroy the last thread of hope she had left. I set it down gently on top of the will, letting the weight of it settle between us, letting her see it, letting her understand exactly what I was offering. "Get a DNA test," I said smoothly, watching as her throat bobbed with a nervous swallow, watching as she froze, watching as the fear in her eyes deepened into something much worse, realization. "Otherwise, walk away now, before you embarrass yourself any further." The silence that followed was excruciating. I could hear my mother's breathing beside me, steady now, controlled, stronger than it had been since the moment this woman had walked through those church doors. I could hear the sound of my own pulse thrumming in my ears, steady and unshaken, my body filled with an unwavering sense of certainty. I could feel the tension rolling off the people around us, the way my father's closest friends had shifted in their seats, the way my relatives had leaned in ever so slightly, all of them waiting, all of them watching for the moment this woman finally broke. And she was breaking. I could see it in the way her lips trembled, in the way her hands curled into fists, in the way she was suddenly struggling to breathe. Her entire world had been built on the foundation of a single belief, the belief that this child was my father's, that she was different from the others, that she had mattered. And now, standing here, staring at the DNA test request in front of her, she was beginning to understand that she might have been wrong about everything. "This is ridiculous," she muttered under her breath, barely audible, shaking her head, trying to cling to what little control she had left. But even as she spoke, even as she tried to sound firm, I could hear the doubt creeping into her voice, the uncertainty twisting through her words like a poison. "Is it?" I asked, raising an eyebrow, letting my voice remain light, almost amused, almost pitying. "Because if you were really so sure, you wouldn't be hesitating right now." Her lips pressed into a thin line, her shoulders rising and falling with each uneven breath, her panic now undeniable. And then, she did the one thing I had been waiting for. She didn't reach for the paper. She didn't snatch it up and demand the test. She didn't immediately claim that she had nothing to hide. Instead, she froze. And in that single moment, in that single hesitation, she told me everything I needed to know. Because deep down, buried beneath all of her arrogance, beneath all of her certainty, beneath the image she had built of herself as my father's one and only, she had never really been sure at all. And now, standing in front of everyone, in a church filled with people who had once pitied her, who had once believed she was just another victim of my father's selfishness, she was realizing something far worse than betrayal. She was realizing that she might not matter at all. For the first time since she had entered the church, the mistress hesitated, her once unshakable confidence cracking like fragile glass, the weight of everything finally pressing down on her shoulders. Her breath was uneven, sharp and shallow, her hands clenched so tightly at her sides that her nails dug into her own skin, but she didn't seem to notice. Every second that passed chipped away at the image she had built of herself, stripping away the arrogance, the smug certainty, the carefully crafted persona she had worn like armor. She wanted to fight back, wanted to argue, wanted to hold onto whatever power she thought she had left, but the cracks in her confidence had spread too deep, the foundation of her claim crumbling beneath her feet like sand slipping through her fingers. I could see it in the way her eyes flickered toward the exit, the way she swallowed hard, the way her fingers twitched as if debating whether to grab the DNA test request or turn and run. I watched the battle play out in real time, the desperate attempt to find a way out, the flickers of denial warring against the creeping horror of realization, the slow unraveling of someone who had walked in believing she was unstoppable. She had come here expecting to walk away victorious, expecting to claim half of everything, expecting my mother to fold beneath the weight of her grief, expecting me to be too weak or too caught off guard to fight back. But instead, she had walked into a battle she had never been prepared for, a war she had already lost, a reality that was shifting beneath her feet like an earthquake. "This isn't over," she muttered, her voice shaky, uneven, but it was clear to everyone, it was already over. Her words were hollow, lacking the bite she had once wielded so effortlessly, lacking the confidence that had carried her through the church doors, lacking the certainty that she had held onto like a lifeline. The silence in the room was deafening, thick with the unspoken truth that every single person could feel hanging in the air. My mother exhaled slowly, pressing her fingertips against the will in her lap, her shoulders straight, her chin lifted just slightly, not out of arrogance, not out of victory, but out of something much stronger, finality. The mistress's lips parted like she wanted to say something more, like she wanted to fight, like she wanted to claw her way out of the hole she had dug for herself. But no words came, because there was nothing left to say. She had stormed into this funeral with her head held high, carrying a child she believed would guarantee her a future, armed with demands she had been so sure would be met with surrender, with tears, with the kind of brokenness that would make it easy to take what she wanted. She had rehearsed her speech, had walked in knowing exactly how she would twist the situation to make herself look like the true victim, had believed so deeply in her own importance that she had never once considered the possibility that my father had lied to her just as easily as he had lied to us. And now, with the will proving she had no legal claim, with the bank records proving she was just one of many affairs, with the DNA test looming over her like a noose waiting to tighten, she was standing in front of us completely powerless. "You should leave," I said finally, my voice steady, my expression calm, my patience long since gone. She turned to me, her eyes flashing, the last remnants of anger still clinging to her like a dying ember, but I wasn't afraid of her. Not anymore. Whatever threat she had once posed, whatever power she had thought she held over this family, had been reduced to nothing. "You think you've won?" she asked, her voice hoarse, her throat tight like she was struggling to breathe, struggling to hold herself together, struggling to find something, anything, that would still make this moment salvageable. "You think this is fair?" I tilted my head slightly, my gaze unwavering, my tone unwavering, my patience stretched far too thin for this game she was still trying to play. "I think you walked into a funeral expecting to rob a grieving widow," I said evenly, watching as her lips pressed into a thin line, watching as her throat bobbed with a hard swallow, watching as the reality of her own actions settled into her bones like a sickness. And now you're upset that you got caught in your own mess. She shook her head violently, her hair falling over her face, her hands trembling as she clutched the crumpled document in her grasp, her entire body rigid with frustration, with disbelief, with the ugly kind of realization that comes when a person is forced to face the truth about themselves. "This isn't fair," she said again, but this time her voice was quieter, weaker, like she wasn't sure she even believed the words anymore. I exhaled, shaking my head slightly, exhaustion creeping in, the weight of the entire situation pressing against my spine. "Fair," I echoed, my voice quieter now, my tone almost unreadable. "Was it fair when my mother found out her husband had been cheating on her? Was it fair when you walked into this funeral demanding money from a family you helped destroy? Was it fair when you thought you could take what wasn't yours and walk away without consequences?" Her breath stuttered, her lips parted, her hands tightening into fists at her sides, her body vibrating with an emotion that I couldn't quite place. Not just anger, not just grief, but something deeper. "I loved him," she whispered, barely audible, her voice cracking under the weight of everything, under the truth, under the realization that the man she had built her future around had never planned to stay. "No," I said softly, shaking my head, my voice not cruel, not mocking, not triumphant, just final. "You loved who he made you believe he was?" She inhaled sharply, her body tensing, her throat bobbing, her gaze flickering toward the exit once again, her mind racing, her heart breaking, her entire world crumbling around her. And then, finally, she took a step back. Until she was at the door, her breath shallow, her hands shaking, her body frozen in place for just a moment longer before she finally turned, finally let herself leave, finally understood that there was nothing left here for her anymore. I watched as she disappeared through the doors, the weight of her presence lifting from the room like a storm finally passing, the tension in the air unraveling, the silence stretching thick and heavy. My mother let out a slow breath, her fingers brushing over the will once more, her lips pressing together in something unreadable, something that wasn't quite sadness, but wasn't quite peace yet either. But one thing was certain. The woman who had walked in here expecting to win had just walked away with nothing at all. A week later, the results of the DNA test arrived, the thin envelope resting between my mother and me on the kitchen table, deceptively small but carrying the weight of everything that had happened, the weight of every lie my father had ever told, the weight of every demand that woman had thrown at us. The air in the room was thick, unmoving, a silence, so heavy that it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting, watching, bracing for whatever truth was about to be revealed. My mother's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her coffee cup, but she didn't lift it to her lips, didn't drink, didn't move except for the slow rise and fall of her chest. I swallowed hard, my fingers brushing against the edge of the envelope, the paper cool and smooth beneath my fingertips, my pulse loud in my ears as I hesitated for just a second longer. This was it. The final answer. The last loose thread that needed to be tied, the last piece of the mess my father had left behind. When I finally reached forward and slid my finger beneath the seal, when I pulled out the paper and scanned the results, when my eyes locked onto the words printed in crisp, unforgiving ink, I let out a breath I hadn't even realized I had been holding. 0% probability of paternity. The words stared back at me, definitive, unwavering, an undeniable truth that shattered whatever scraps of hope that woman had left. I turned the page toward my mother, letting her see it for herself, letting her absorb it in her own time, watching as her expression shifted from nervous anticipation to sheer, overwhelming relief. Her lips parted slightly, her breath hitching for just a moment, and then, finally, after weeks of grief, of anger, of betrayal, she exhaled. Truly exhaled. A breath that carried more than just air, a breath that carried freedom, a breath that carried release, a breath that carried the end of a nightmare she had never asked to be part of in the first place. Neither of us spoke for a long moment, the only sound in the room the faint ticking of the clock on the wall, the distant hum of traffic outside, the quiet creak of wood beneath my mother's shifting weight as she sat back in her chair. She ran a hand over her face, smoothing away the exhaustion that had been lingering there for far too long, blinking rapidly as if trying to process the full weight of what she was reading. And then, slowly, her lips curled upward, Not into a smile of victory, not into a smirk of satisfaction, but into something softer, something lighter, something that looked a lot like peace. As for the mistress, she was gone, vanished without another word, her threats dissolving into nothing, her once unshakable confidence reduced to a distant memory, her plans crumbling the moment she had realized there was nothing left to take. There had been no dramatic goodbye, no final confrontation, no desperate last-ditch effort to claw her way back into the life she had tried to steal. Instead, she had simply disappeared, her presence erased as quickly as it had arrived, leaving behind nothing but a hollow space where her arrogance had once stood. She had walked into that funeral expecting to take everything, expecting to rewrite the story in her favor, expecting to claim a future built on the ashes of my father's lies. But in the end, she had left with nothing. And my mother? She had everything. Her dignity, her home, and, most importantly, her freedom from my father's betrayal forever.